Before I start, I was a bit apprehensive about giving this talk to this group. There's a lot of Lustre expertise in here. I am not a Lustre developer. I am in software development for the Cluster Store product line, but my viewpoint of the system of Lustre is that more of an administrator or an integrator, and then the software that I focus on building is the software that is supposed to automate or improve ease of use for administrators. Some of my focus areas do include security, basic security configuration, and so that's what I'm talking about. To be clear, there's a lot of security topics around. I'm not talking today about SE Linux, even though we have the Cluster Store SDA product, and Torben would hit me if I didn't plug that. And I'm not talking about the UID-GID mapping or any of the sexy new features that are forthcoming Kerberos GSS API. But I'm talking about just basic making it work. And what I've observed in the last few years is there are a number of people who have trouble with that, and they resort to, okay, what's the magic incantation? They type the incantation, they get the system up and working, and they're done with that. So over half of the Lustre administrators, or over half of Lustre installations we've heard are self-supported, and that means that even Lustre administrators probably have better acquaintance with the Lustre code than me. Given the high caliber of people who work on this and the people who know this code, my goal is to address the people who don't know it as well, which might be 2 or 3 people in this room, and maybe people watching on the web later. So I will understand if you're a little bit, I don't know, irritated at some of the fundamentals that I go over, or the oversimplifications that I might make in order to make my points. So, but I do hope it will be useful for some. So, right. So, moving on. I do welcome anyone's feedback, especially corrections to anything I get wrong. So again, focusing on basic user security. One of the things that I hear a lot is what's wrong with user authentication. Authentication, authorization, people get these confused. They're very similar words. I prefer to use the words login and permissions. Authentication is about establishing identity. That's your login process. That's who you are. Authorization is a permission check. That's how you get access to things. So that's kind of an important distinction. The common frameworks for dealing with these two things in Linux are PAM, the Pluggable Authentication Module framework, and the named service switch. Everybody in here is probably familiar with these. I don't need to go into them, but the key takeaway here is that PAM is mostly about identity, and the named service switch is used in the course of checking permissions. It is not itself the permission resolver, but it is used in that context. The actual concept of identity is provided by what I abstract as a security service. There are several different options that are appropriate to Lustre environments. There are more than are listed here, but these are common ones. The LDAP is one of the most common. Active Directory, which is essentially LDAP, but with somewhat different schemas. The Network Information System, the old Sun Yellow Pages, and then classical etc password, etc group files, which are in a Lustre environment, which is all the nodes need to have the same representation. Those files get replicated to all the different nodes. In the context of Lustre, we have the same two issues, login and permission check. The login happens through the PAM and NSS configured accounts on the nodes, on the Lustre clients in particular, but they are also typically configured on the servers. And then the actual permission resolution happens through the UID and GID that goes through the Lustre, or goes to the Lustre MDS. That is not the users directly accessing the MDS, that is just through the Lustre client and through the protocols. So this is the part where you can start yawning. We're constrained in POSIX by the POSIX model, which is kind of everything is on one computer, and we're now talking about distributed systems. So the concept of POSIX identity is that there is a user and it is known to me right here and right now in this context, and there's a group and their groups are known to me right here and right now in this context, and a user can be in different groups. And then the way that these are encoded is numeric. There's a group ID and a user ID, and every user has a default group ID. Then when things are happening and we're talking about processing permissions, each process has the effective UID and GID of the process. That usually comes from the user who logged in and started the process. This is pretty standard. Then the process sends these two numbers to the file system in order to evaluate the permissions. The file system has encoded in directory records the owner and group IDs, the numbers, as well as permission flags, and access control list, which just kind of extends the capabilities a little bit, but pretty much work the same. So, the actual permission check scenario, I'll zip through this, but mainly the idea is that when the numbers match in the record and in the request, things are good. So if you have a group that matches the group, you're good. And when you have a UID that doesn't match the UID and the group ID that doesn't match the group ID, you have a question of how does the file system know how to deal with this permission? And so that's the key question that I've had customers and managers and just all sorts of people ask me for the last few years is, why does this even matter? What's wrong with authentication? I'm like, no, it's a permissions thing. And this is what I have to explain to them, is how these things work. How this matters in Lustre. So again, Lustre has login and it has permissions checking. So, little cartoon. Again, I've abstracted the security service. I'm not saying that it's in the cloud. I'm using the cloud representing an abstraction, which is what started the whole cloud word. But anyway, and we have Lustre clients, and we have Lustre servers, and we have a human being over here named Jane, who has an account based on her name and some silly password. Jane is going to log in directly or indirectly to the Lustre clients. These Lustre clients then are going to talk to the security service. Again, this might be replicated Etsy group and Etsy password files. And the security service is going to come back and say, yes, it's successful, here's your UID, GID. And nowhere in this process are the Lustre servers involved. So that's kind of a key takeaway of that part. File access after you're logged in. Simple scenario. If the number matches, Jane is 3013, and may Jane access this particular file, the request goes to the MDS, process the permission flags, done. And you notice that the security service was not involved in that at all. So, get to a slightly more complex scenario where the numbers don't match. It's a different UID, GID in both cases. We don't have the ability to process these flags. The MDS does not have the information in directory records to be able to process this. So, it has to talk to the security service. And this one little thing is the one thing that trips up so many people in configuring Lustre. I don't know why, but there's a magic incantation that makes it work, and so that's what people tend to do. And that's configuring the identity upcall. So here's the magic incantation. And the most important thing is that this is an external tool. It's a user space tool, and it is separate from the Lustre kernel modules. It's not LCTL and LFS are tools designed to wrap around Lustre. This is distributed with Lustre, but it is not specifically a part of Lustre itself. And the framework of it, as you might guess from the structure, allows you to specify different ways of doing upcall other than what is default. So to get past my double negative, there are multiple ways of doing this. So start with the first, most common. This used to be called lget groups. I don't know if anybody uses that name anymore. It is the default, and it looks for identity, or it looks for the user and group accounts on the MDS using NSS as it's configured on the MDS. So the name service switch is going to tell what groups and users exist, either through Etsy group or Etsy password, Etsy groups, or through LDAP or NIS or some other configured service. What this means is that these accounts typically are just directly configured on the MDS node at a minimum, if not configured on the entire cluster. There is another upcall utility that, in my experience, is common. A little bit of disclosure on this. I was under the impression for quite a while that this tool, which was developed back in 2011, was available to the community, and then I went and looked at Jira tickets and found out that it was not. I realize that's a sticky point to some people. I hope that you'll see after a few more slides that it doesn't really matter anyway. But this is designed specifically for Active Directory interaction, and it uses specific queries to connect to an configuration to connect to an Active Directory server, and uses specific queries on that using the LDAP protocol to resolve user and group identity queries. This particular upcall utility supports only one Active Directory server. It does not support SSL. It doesn't support a lot of other features that you might hope would work. So it's still a useful point of comparison. Difference between the two is that getidentity can do anything that LADS identity can do, but that's if you configure your local accounts correctly on the MDS nodes. So if you configure Active Directory interaction on the MDS node separate of the utility itself, then getidentity will be able to look that up using the standard NSS lookup. And that basically means if you, for instance, set up LDAP to point to your Active Directory server, set up your mappings using nslcd.conf, using one of the correct appropriate schemas for whatever your Active Directory implementation is, because there are several. And I believe that this is kind of the standard now, RFC 2307, but there are a couple of different variations of that are preceded that, and then there's the really old Microsoft services for Unix. So it's possible to configure interaction with Active Directory without using this special upcall utility. And if you do it that way, by configuring taking a little bit of extra step in your configuration, you can do things that LADS identity cannot do, including configuring backup servers, SSL connections, and alternate bind methods to LDAP. So there's a little bit of advantage in getidentity. getidentity does have some limitations. This is a matter of perspective. It requires a lot of configuration outside of what you're doing with Lustre. So you're configuring the base Linux system. You're putting a lot of effort into that before you even get to the point of testing upcall at all in the first place. So there's a lot of things that have to go on before the MDS can even start doing what it needs to do. And if you do the minimal, and I should say the minimal effort, if you do the minimal amount of work in order to do this, if you go on the web and you look up recipes for how to configure Active Directory, how to configure NIS, how to configure LDAP, and you follow those blindly, as some administrators and integrators are likely to do, then what you're going to do is end up with both PAM and NSS configured, which means that users are going to be able to log in directly to your MDS node. So that's kind of undesirable in the general context of security. Some sites really don't want people logging into the MDS nodes or the OSS nodes directly. The server and the client, they want separation there. They want the accounts existing only on the client nodes. So there are ways to prevent this that require additional manual configuration. If you want to take the steps to do that, you can. You can set your shell, you can play with PAM settings, you can disable certain parts of PAM. That's additional steps, that's more risk, that's more possibilities for getting things wrong in your configuration. So we looked at that a little while back and said, well, maybe there's another way to do it, because there's another way to do it. And so we looked at creating a new utility similar to getidentity, but it's based on NSS. So we want to use the benefits of NSS configuration, where the accounts exist externally from the local nodes, So LDAP, including Active Directory support, NIS, and really anything else that has an NSS plugin, because NSS and PAM are both frameworks where there's lots of different plugins available. And we wanted to create something that works with that and leverages all that goodness, but not ever create any local accounts on MDS nodes, or, well, and of course they're not needed on OSS nodes. In this case, this Upcall utility allows you to upload a password and group file into etc Lustre. Those files follow the exact same format as the typical Unix files, except that you only need to populate the relevant fields, which would be the UID, the username, the group ID, group names, and that's it. So relatively simple to use. You could even push copies of that from a master server somewhere. The other advantage to this is that even though we're leveraging what NSS does, we might want to have a slightly different service order, so that's separately specifiable through this utility. So just going back to compare a couple of points, getidentity NSS can do anything that getidentity can do that's relevant to Lustre Upcall. So getidentity, you know, if you take the configuration of that plus all of the base Linux system configuration that you do, then they're really equivalent when in terms of what happens with Lustre, is what I'm saying. And it has the advantage that it doesn't open up user logins on Lustre servers. So you can have as many MDS nodes as you like, and you don't have user logins because there's no concept of a local account for those users. And they do both still require the base configuration of the system. You still have to set up your NSS configuration at a minimum for getidentity NSS. So that is a little bit outside the scope of the utility itself, but it is a little bit less work than getidentity would be. So again, this is kind of a question of preference and a question of what are your requirements. There's a question of, is this even needed? We don't hear people saying, oh gosh, I need a new Upcall utility. I just don't like the one I have. Can I have one with French fries or ketchup or something? But we do hear concerns about security, and that was kind of what started us down this path, was trying to find a new way to address that. I did check with our Lustre team and a few other people and asked them if we were considering committing this upstream, if we were looking at that. And the responses that I got were a little bit eye-opening. They, I guess, seemed to be concerned about the number of reviewers available and whether or not it was worth wasting anybody's time. So part of the reason that I'm here today is to ask for a utility like this, as I've explained it. Is there actually any interest? There is some possibility that if direct upstream commit wasn't viable, that maybe we could put it on the Zyratex GitHub. That might be one way at least to get it out and available to people who are interested, but please do see me after if you do have curiosity about this and want to know more. So the only other thing that, the other thing that prompted me down this path of wanting to talk about Upcall, which is such this basic little corner of Lustre, is I gave a talk last year about configuring Samba gateways, and I made a kind of passing mention to configuring security, and particularly configuring Upcall with Samba gateways, and that got a lot of reaction and a lot of people following up after and saying, oh, but can you support this, and can you support that, and can you support this? And so it gets a little bit more complicated. If we go back to our cartoon, the main takeaway of this is that the Lustre client and the Samba gateway essentially behave the same with respect to the security service and the MDS in terms of what they're doing with those respective things. Instead of logging into the Lustre client directly, our user logs into a Windows system or SMB client, which authenticates potentially to the same security service or potentially a different one. In a lot of cases, people do want that to be the same security service. Then has to connect to the share. So there's a separate action going on here. And in that connection to the share, the same credentials are passed because that's part of the SMB protocol. And then the Samba gateway has to be able to use those credentials in the same way that the Lustre client uses them over here, which is causing or doing the permissions check and the security service check during the connect. So it uses the credentials for the connect as if it was a login. And then the access on either side will result in upcall potentially. So there's a possible case where the security service, so the magic sauce on the Samba gateway is getting of course, the Samba configuration right. And that's not directly related to upcall, but that's a matter of Samba configuration. And the two keys to that are making sure that your ID map is correct and that your protocol configuration is correct. And it's the same work you'd have to do on the Lustre client to cause authentication through NSS, PAM, that sort of thing, with the addition of having to configure things for Samba itself in the smb.conf. And new versions of Samba, I can't go into all the details because every situation is different, but there are new ID map options, which there's a whole bunch of them, and if you find the right ones for your scenario, whether you're connecting to LDAP or Active Directory or anything else, there's a lot of options there to make that work. And in fact, some of them will manufacture UIDs and GIDs for you if you're using a security service that doesn't have them. And in that case, that would be something very, very useful to use with the future feature of UID GID mapping that's coming up in the next version of Lustre. And then finally, in the case of different security services, we've encountered scenarios where the Windows systems actually authenticate to Active Directory, but the Lustre clients and Samba server actually authenticate to NIS instead. So I don't know if anybody else here has encountered an environment like this. We've encountered enough of them to make me think that it's more common than I would have expected. But NIS for Lustre and Active Directory for Windows, and then they use some ID mapping service. There's a couple of them available. One is called Centrify. That maps the identity between NIS and Active Directory. So that goes back to the Samba configuration and the NSLCD configuration on the Samba servers to make sure that they are mapping the IDs correctly. And again, I don't have an incantation for you for that, because that's another situation where it's going to depend on what you're doing. So that was kind of a lot, but hopefully you got something out of it.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment and a request. So first off, I don't think you needed to apologize at the top of your talk. I found that very interesting. And the request I would make is, you presented this material nice and concisely and explained, the get identity that exists today. I would ask you to go to make a contribution to the ops manual, because I've reviewed that section of the document and it's not that clear. We could really use your help there. Thank you.
Excellent suggestion. I'll look into that.
Hey, Chris. Hey, it's a bit loud. I was just going to say, you had asked about whether it would be welcome to upstream something, whether there was issues around review times. I would say even if something, is going to wait because of volume of requests, it's still worth upstreaming it and keeping things in one place rather than having things scattered and harder to find. So I don't think that's a question you need to ask.
Good input. Again, the developers that I talk to, because Upcall is this separate thing off to the side, they're external utilities. That was part of the consideration as well. But I can go back and push on that again.
Yes, I have me. How about the scalability of such a solution? So, for example, maybe over 100,000 nodes and maybe over 3,000 OSs. In other cases, maybe a server based security service, not scalable. So, is there any recommendation for the such kind of security service? Because maybe so such a kind of a large scale system, we don't such kind of end up too slow to use. So that's a problem.
So yeah, so a lot of this doesn't really address doing security at scale. I mean, the idea is, accounts are configured where they're configured, and if you use the technique of copying etc password and etc group across to your systems, that's a technique you have to work out for yourself if that's going to address what you need at scale. And if you use a centralized system, then you have to look at what's the load on your Active Directory servers, and maybe you have a swarm of LDAP or Active Directory servers, and that's how you manage the scalability of it. But
just to add to that, only the MDS is doing the authentication, not the OSSs, so it doesn't matter scalability there.
Yeah, so the number of OSSs doesn't matter at all, and in fact, you don't ever need to create accounts on the OSS nodes.
And the second thing is that the MDS, I mean, it has a cache for doing the upcalls, so for 5 minutes or whatever, it will cache the results from the server. So
right. So if you have an unreasonable number of users using it all at once, then you have to worry about that cache a little bit, but.
You said the existing getIdentity call would require PAM to be configured. Can you elaborate on that?
No, not that it requires PAM to be configured, but that if you do it in the most brain-dead way possible, following, getIdentity requires there to be that local identity, that local account to exist on the system. You can do it without PAM. That's more work than most people are going to know how to do. Most people are going to follow a recipe that's going to configure the account to be local and have login available.
I think you underestimate system administrators at this point.
As I said before, the system administrators have different levels of expertise, and there are many in this room who are maybe you underestimate your own level of expertise. I've encountered many people who will follow the recipes and consider it done.
Yeah. Well, my point is. I need to configure my NSS anyway to provide access to Lustre clients.
Yes.
And the Lustre server is just one extra server I have to configure in the same way I configure all my other clients anyway. So please don't start inventing any new mechanisms to configure system accounts or user access. I'm much more comfortable with doing the same thing on keeping it homogeneous across all my machines than having special machines requiring special configuration. And if I have to do special configuration, I'm much more comfortable in using standard methods like etc security limits or whatever, or not configuring PAM or not doing anything unless I have password hashes in my etc passwd file. And then having one Lustre-specific type of configuration that's of no use anywhere else.
Understood. So that goes back to my question: is this actually something valuable and people would want? And what I'm hearing you say is no, you don't want this. It would get in your way. And essentially, yes. So it's not appropriate for everyone. In my view of the world, in the cluster store box that we create, we want to be able to control everything in that box, and so that's not. So our MDS nodes, and it's more than one server if you have multiple MDS nodes, which I think will be more and more common now. If you're taking the responsibility to configure those, then you should be able to do it in whatever way you want, and getIdentity might be the most appropriate thing for you. If you are using a provided system where there's software configuring it for you, then that's one of the reasons that we developed this tool, was so that we could do that for ourselves. So if we release this code out to the wild and other people start using it, maybe that would frustrate people, or maybe we just advise them of the appropriate use case and let them know that there's drawbacks potentially.
Okay, thank you, Chris.